and welcome to Top Secret TV. My name's David Becker. On tonight's show we speak with John Fitzsimons. John's a New Age teacher and lecturer. He lectures interstate and in Victoria, and used to be a press photographer. But at the moment he's running the group Aspects, as he has been since 1970. Welcome, John.
Hi.
How are you this evening?
Well, thanks.
That's good. Now, I understand that you, amongst other things, including psychic protection and spirit rescue work, you actually regress people to past lives.
That's great.
Can you tell us a little bit about past life regression?
Yes, people go back to past lives to discover different things relevant to this lifetime. There are different methods of doing that. People who come to me are mainly interested in spiritual perspectives as to what sort of mistakes they make in past lives and what relevance they have to now. But there are many other people who do regression from a more therapeutic point of view, such as medical doctors, psychologists and psychiatrists.
How do you actually regress someone?
Well, the method I use is generally relaxation. A lot of other people use hypnosis, which is a very more commonly known approach. I don't use hypnosis because I don't find that I need it.
What do you see as some of the evidence that suggests that past life regression is a valid phenomenon?
Well, personally, the thing that's most convincing for myself is the experiencing of the recall. People are very, very much involved in the experience. If someone is fantasizing and making it up, then they would be extremely good actors or actresses. And the things that they look at are often very, very pertinent to their current life, their fears, their phobias, their relationships with other people, with society in general. But there are other validation points that people use, such as discovering buildings that may have been at certain cities and certain centuries, certain streets, even hidden rooms, corridors, things like that, that act as validation points.
So you're saying that they actually describe places and surroundings that maybe in another country, even in perhaps, several centuries ago, and then they can go there and say, wow, this is the place?
That's right. Someone who was fairly well noted early in the 1980s or late 70s, somebody in Australia called Peter Ramster, a hypnotherapist, used to regress people, and he possibly still does, regress people in Sydney to overseas places in past centuries, and then he would then actually literally go to those places, sometimes with or without these people, to see whether the things that they had described were actually there. There was another person in London called Arthur Bloxham who regressed this lady back to a time in York where she was a Jewess, and she was chased by the King's men in a persecution type situation into a cathedral and went into a crypt and went down there for safety, sanctuary from the King's men. They followed her into that and ended up killing her. And then Arthur Bloxham then went to York to investigate whether the cathedral was there, the crypt was there, and the historical facts were correct, and so on. They couldn't find the crypt. And then some months later, the priest or minister, whoever he was, phoned this Arthur Bloxham in London and said, how did you know about our crypt, the crypt that you were talking about us having 6 months ago, which at the time they didn't think they had. Apparently somebody put a foot through the floor because the floorboards were old and started pulling the floorboards up, and there was a crypt.
And that's something that they couldn't possibly have known.
Well, no one alive apparently did know that there was a crypt there.
It's quite extraordinary, and this is a reasonably common occurrence. I mean, quite a few
Well,
people...
I wouldn't say it was common, but it's kind of like, say, how many kangaroos do you have to see if you're Chinese to know that kangaroos exist?
Yeah. So, where can you sort of regress to? There's a range of different places or states of being, I guess, that you can regress to. I mean, the obvious one is past lives, but what are some of the other states or places that you can go to?
Well, sometimes people go back to an existence that's not on this planet, so what some people would call an alien life. Some people go to the experience just immediately following death. Some people go to the experience between their physical death and their starting of a new existence. Sometimes they go to just before their new existence, and sometimes go through kind of like a list of things that they hope to achieve in that coming lifetime. And this is particularly interesting if you then compare that list and the life that follows with the end of that life, to see kind of like a checklist of how many things they hope to achieve as against how many things they actually did achieve.
So you believe in the idea that we're here with a specific set of purposes for each life?
Correct. And sometimes this is an individual situation, sometimes it's part of a group situation, what some people call group reincarnation.
So is that where your work comes in order to assist people in revealing to themselves their own purposes?
Yes. A lot of people go through life, especially sometimes heading to middle age, and they wonder, well, why am I here? Where am I going? Where have I been? And what's the meaning of life? It's kind of like filling in time between birth and death.
Geez, I must have hit an early middle age then. Now, there's a couple of, I guess, New Age axioms that are often said. One of them is that people in families travel together through previous lives. Do you think that's true?
I think there's some truth in it, but I wouldn't say that they recycle kind of like in a family. You might have 10 or 20 or 30 close people that you have relationships with, which some of whom may be in your extended family, and sometimes you can be married to the same person a number of lives, but not necessarily in the same role, in the sense of male-female. The other person who may be the female this time may be the male last time or next time.
Right. I remember when we spoke earlier, we talked about the idea of say, an example of somebody who, say, is beating up somebody in one life, the roles might be reversed in the next life.
Correct.
It suggests that there's kind of like karmic balance implications there?
That's right. A lot of people would think twice about doing things to other people if they only remembered that a lot of the things that they are doing will in due course come back. As one sows, one reaps.
And that actually brings on an interesting point. Why is it that we forget previous lives?
How many people want to remember their mistakes? I find that a lot of people don't want to remember their mistakes in this lifetime, so therefore they don't want to remember mistakes in past lifetimes either.
What about triumphs, though?
Oh, well, yes, people can remember that, but I personally don't think there's a lot to be learned from a triumph. You learn from your mistakes, I believe. And I think, to answer your question, basically people often don't want to remember past lives.
Oh, okay, so it's like a past life regression is working against a repressed memory almost? Would you say that?
It's working against escapism, perhaps.
Okay, so how does your work actually, or people like yourselves, help in our current lives? What can past life regression offer us?
Well, there's many different areas. Phobias, for example, are often a past life situation. If you in a past life had drowned, you could be very anxious about water now. If in a past life you were in a, say a woman was in a bad sexual situation, maybe raped in a past life and she's a female again in this lifetime, she may have a great difficulty with relating with men. Certain skills we bring forward, certain difficulties we also have to overcome and we can learn from. Sometimes we make the same mistake life after life, and we sometimes tend to make the same one again, and being aware that we've made that mistake helps us to perhaps think twice about doing it again.
So you actually brought up an interesting point there with skills between lives. Where does child prodigies and like extraordinary people like Beethoven who are playing, you know, writing piano concertos at the age of 5 or whatever come into it? Is that anything to do with past lives?
Yes, I think a lot of these so-called prodigies are people who are just continuing on with a skill that they've practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced. If you played the piano 5 or 10 or 20 years, or 5 or 10 or 100 or 200 or 500 years, or 1,000 or 2,000 years, you would get a certain skill in that particular thing. And so sometimes children are very open, they're very aware of past lives, they're aware of the skills that they have, and this can help them to, you know, develop that skill more quickly by that memory, that in-tuneness, if you like.
And the Chinese idea that we're on like a wheel continuously going life after life after life, they almost make it sound like a trap in a sense. What's your viewpoint on the philosophy of that life after life after life with apparent no end? Is there an end?
Well, I believe there is, in the planetary sense. We can learn all the lessons that there are to be learned on this particular planet and then start a new cycle on another planet or in another solar system.
Does that imply that...
Or another dimension, perhaps.
So is there a hierarchy, so that other planet or solar system is superior in a sense?
In the spiritual sense, yes.
And the end goal being?
Well, the end goal, having learned all the lessons in that particular cycle, I think perhaps there's constantly new lessons to be learnt, new things to do.
Yeah. So the journey itself being the goal, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Rather than destination.
Okay. So one of the other most commonly asked questions, actually, this is a bit of a silly one, but I have to ask it. People often ask, can you retrograde back to being like an insect or a, fly on a gnat's back or whatever? Is it possible?
I expect anything is possible. I would expect that it would be extremely unlikely. It's kind of like asking somebody in university, do they want to go to kindergarten? Well, of course, the answer is yes. They could go to kindergarten, but do they want to? No. Is it likely that they will go to kindergarten after being to university? No. So, in theory, one can go back to an earlier lesson in this life or in the wider scope of things. But even though it's possible, I'd say it would be highly unlikely. In other words, about 99.9% likely that it wouldn't happen.
So it would,
I wouldn't be so arrogant as to say it's impossible.
Right, okay. Yeah, so I guess it would require an enormous spiritual value for it to be that way. Now, have you ever come across any kind of, I guess you could call them anomalies, like, say, people running 2 lives simultaneously or something like that?
Yes, if you understand the concept of the oversoul concept, where parts of your soul are part of a collective consciousness, then one can then be running lives in simultaneous existence. In fact, some people have asked me to be aware of parallel lives that they are currently living along with the one they're living now, as another person for all intents and purposes, but in reality part of the same soul grouping.
And they can have consciousness of that other consciousness?
Awareness of it.
Right, yeah.
If they wish to. It depends on whether it serves their spiritual purpose.
Right, okay. Another topic we touched on earlier before we started tonight was the role of spirit guides. Now, where do they come into it? I understand you use them quite a lot in your work.
That's correct. Well, supposing you're very close to your girlfriend or your wife or your daughter or something like this. Now, if they died, they may still be interested in you, they may still love you, and hopefully you'd still love them even though they're physically dead. So they may wish to guide you. So they would in this lifetime be to you a spirit guide, as your sister or your daughter or your wife or whatever. Now the same thing happens in future lives. Supposing you were very close to your wife now and you both die and you go into another lifetime following this one and she decides she doesn't want to get born immediately, she may continue on as guide for you in that future life. So she's acting as a spirit guide.
Okay. In between lives, do you have, or do people have complete choice? They can decide what they want to be, who they want to be, whatever is best for them to learn their lessons?
Yes, the higher self actually dictates that. But as the person gets more aware, is more evolved as a soul, one has more involvement. It's kind of like in the physical world. Does a 5 or 6 year old child have a lot of say in his schooling? Perhaps not a lot. Does a 12-year-old have much say in her schooling or his schooling? More so. Does an 18-year-old have any say in their schooling? I'd say a lot more. So as one learns more and as one becomes more mature, one makes more of the choices oneself.
Are there any clear patterns that can be seen in past life regression? I mean, do we all go to the same place in between lives or experience the same things, or do the same things happen? Are there any kind of patterns that you've been able to discern throughout the years?
Well, we basically go to the spirit world and have very similar experiences. The spirit world is not a lot different than the physical world in the sense of, to put it bluntly, I suppose, scenery in general, people relating with each other as friends and acquaintances and discussing things. So yes, there's a commonality there, which is quite interesting when you consider that each person who comes is often from a different religious background or different sort of, they're coloured by different, upbringings.
Right. So, what would this typical sort of place look like? I mean, can a person who's a Muslim be living in a wonderful Muslim paradise, while a person who's a Buddhist be living in whatever the equivalent of a Buddhist paradise is?
Yes, they can, but it depends on what sort of life they lived when they were physically alive. If an Arab had led a good life in the sense of caring and sharing and giving and helping other people, then he or she may live in a very plush place. Someone who's been very selfish and greedy and self-centered and not helped anybody would not end up in a mansion. They may end up in a less lugubrious sort of establishment.
Right. And is that determined by their actual actions, or is it determined by their perception of their actions? Like, say, if a person was really greedy but thought that they'd been a really good person during their life, would they go to a wonderful place, or would they go to a not so wonderful place?
No, it would be by the truth of their actions. People, I think, inside know whether they're doing right or wrong, however much they try to hide that in themselves and try to pretend, oh yes, I'm not as selfish as I really am, or not as greedy, or not as jealous, or not as angry. But in reality, the person internally does know truthfully what they are.
You've spoken on several occasions about a higher self. Can you actually explain what a higher self is?
Well, one could say it's the higher aspect of one's beingness, the God identity, if you like, the thing that's closest to being perfect in our beingness.
Yeah. Do the guides that are with us have some sort of contact with the higher self?
Yes, it's kind of a hierarchy, so that they go up to somebody else, and they go up to somebody else, and they go up to somebody. It's like a huge bureaucracy in a sense, but in the sense that the next person up is more spiritually aware, and the next person up from that is more spiritually aware. So one goes up as far as is needed to get the answer to the particular question that the person wants to know.
And how far up can your average human being get in contact with? Like, for example, we could probably get in contact with our own spirit guides, but could we get in contact with our own high self?
The former rather than the latter.
Right.
The need to know basis comes in.
How so?
Well, one can ask for all the wisdom of the universe, but whether one's needing that wisdom and whether one's allowed to have that is another question altogether.
Now, you spoke earlier about a technique that you use, which is relaxation. Can people actually regress themselves or access their own past lives?
Yes, sometimes people use relaxation tapes. Sometimes they remember past lives in dream state. Sometimes they have things that trigger recall. Sometimes they might say particular words or think of particular things that are triggers. So say, for example, you had a fear of water and you wanted to find out whether it had something to do with a past life. Well, you might relax and think and try and associate an image or a feeling or a mood with water. And if you're reasonably well relaxed, then you would have a reasonable chance of remembering something that happened relative to water.
Are there techniques that your average layperson can use to differentiate between their imagination and what is actually a past life memory?
It's very difficult. That's why I suggest that people do it ideally with someone who knows what they're doing, so that you're not just fantasizing, you're not just making things up. If you're fantasizing, that sort of a situation of the water, or drowning perhaps, would have not a lot of effect on you because it's just fantasy, you're just messing around. Something that is actually, that has actually occurred to you has much more power, much more impact on you.
Right, so there'll be more emotion.
More emotion, more involvement, more of a result.
And is that one of the clinical measures you use to determine? Okay.
Yes, another method I use is ask the person detailed questions. If, say, I asked you, you've seen plenty of movies with Red Indians. Now, I could ask you, pretend to be a Red Indian, which of course you could start doing. But in a past life, I could ask you very detailed questions about being a Red Indian. And I could keep asking you questions. Whereas if I ask you questions about Red Indian now, after 5 minutes you've run out of things to make up. You think, oh, well, maybe, but... and you start guessing, and it's obvious that you're guessing.
Okay, so it breaks down and that's when it becomes clear what the person's talking about. Do you have actually people coming to you and deliberately trying to catch you out, I guess you could say? Or even deluding themselves?
Yes, the latter rather than the former, because what's the point of coming to me and pretending to have past lives you don't have?
Yeah, it'd be a waste of time. Now, we actually have a huge array of books here that's quite a popular field. Just sort of hold up some of these titles. Are there many Australian titles, or is most of the research done overseas?
Well, I've already mentioned our local research up in Sydney, Peter Ramster. He's a hypnotherapist, but a lot of the work is done overseas, yes. There are medical doctors doing research, there are psychologists doing research, there are psychiatrists doing research, There are psychics doing research.
Really?
There are authors doing research. There are just ordinary people doing research. So it's pretty widespread, the research that's being done by a variety of different people from different disciplines.
Right. How are the scientists, or some of the scientists, what are some of the scientific techniques that are being used to try and discover whether there's truth to past
Well,
things?
the main approach they tend to take is validating the experiences and correlating people's stories as to whether they mesh, whether they are contradicting each other or contradicting themselves. Because if you ask a person to go to a life, say a week or a month or a year or 2 years separating, the story should be the same both times if it existed.
Right.
If you're making something up, say for example now you made up a story about being somebody, and we come back in 6 months' time and I say, well, pretend you're Jenny Kay or whatever, whoever you made up your mind to be,
Yeah.
the likelihood of you being consistent in your information, unless you'd researched that person very, very well, would not be very, very great.
One of the perhaps more famous people, Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, he regressed people, well, I guess sort of inadvertently, to Atlantean lives. Do you get much of that?
It depends on whether I ask them to go back to Atlantis.
Okay.
I usually suggest to the people to go to a life that is relevant to this current one, and that may or may not be an Atlantean life. A lot of people who have issues with water go back to Atlantean lives where they and many hundreds and thousands and even millions of people went underwater.
Yeah.
Also, Atlantean lives have a lot to do with the current interest or lack of interest or fear of psychic things. Because in Atlantis, a lot of people were involved in energy use and crystal use and abe use.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And what are some of the other periods of time that people can go back to? I mean, I guess it could be anything from caveman to, American Civil War to anywhere.
Yes, certainly. People go back to being Roman soldiers, go back to being in French Revolution, into, being gypsies. It's really more relevant what they did in that life rather than what society did. It's really what society did, kings and queens and civilization, is more the tapestry around them. How were they in that situation? If they were in some French court, were they greedy? Were they selfish? Were they lazy? Were they whatever?
Right, and how that relates to their current...
That's right. It's not a case of were they in court or were they living in the boondocks somewhere?
Yeah.
Were they living in a tent or teepee or cave? The point is, what did they do in that environment with themselves, with other people?
Now, as I said earlier, you actually are running a group called Aspects. If people want to learn more about this, how can they get in contact with you?
Well, I'm in the phone book under Aspects. Also, I'm on the internet, and also my name's John Fitzsimons, so I'm in the phone book in Clayton under that.
Right.
So I'm quite easy to contact.
Okay, and with the group, what are some of the topics or workshops that you do?
Well, I run seminars from time to time, and I give guest talks to different groups on healing and past lives, mediumship, psychic protection. I also sell books on these sort of topics for people who are interested in learning more about these things, these sorts of books, for example.
Yeah.
And I write articles for New Age journals. I end up being interviewed by the media. And I go to New Age fairs, so I tend to travel around interstate and occasionally overseas as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being on the program tonight, John
Thank you.
Fitzsimons. All right, that's all we have time for this week. Stay tuned for more Optus Local Vision programming, and we'll catch you next week. So until then, good night.